The American West produced a specific kind of myth. The man with the gun, the straight draw, the code of honor enforced at the point of a barrel. Most of it was invented after the fact, by dime novelists, by newspaper correspondents who needed copy, by Hollywood directors who needed heroes and villains, and found that the historical record was flexible enough to supply both on demand. But underneath the mythology are real people, real guns, and real bodies in real graves. This list ranks 10 of the most significant figures in that history, not just by kill count, but by what their lives meant, what their deaths revealed, and why the legend that grew around them tells us something important about the country that needed them to exist. The ranking runs from 10 to 1. Disagreement is encouraged. Number 10. Belle Starr, 1848 to 1889. Belle Starr's place on this list is the most contested, and the contest is itself the most interesting thing about her. Known as the Bandit Queen, a title conferred by the National Police Gazette, which had no interest in accuracy and every interest in circulation. Belle was convicted of horse theft, associated with Cole Younger and Jesse James, and eventually shot in the back near her Oklahoma home in February 1889 by an unknown killer who has never been conclusively identified. The violence attributed to her directly is thin, unverified, and substantially the product of journalism that understood her value as a character rather than a subject. What makes her significant is precisely this. She was a woman operating in a world that the mythology of the West had decided was entirely male, and the mythology could not process her except through exaggeration. The real Belle Starr was a tough, resourceful woman who rode well, broke laws selectively, and was murdered before anyone had the chance to establish exactly what she had and hadn't done. The legend filled the gap. The legend always fills the gap. Hollywood's treatment of her illustrates the problem precisely. The 1941 Fox production Belle Starr cast Jean Tierney in the role, arguably one of the most beautiful actresses in Hollywood history, and delivered a romantic adventure that bore essentially no relationship to the historical record, but sold considerable quantities of tickets. The 1980 television film with Elizabeth Montgomery took a more grounded approach with similar dramatic results. The real woman resists the form. No film about Belle Starr has yet managed to be more interesting than the question of who shot her in the back on that February evening in 1889. Number 9. Pat Garrett, 1850 to 1908. Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid in the dark. He entered a bedroom at Pete Maxwell's ranch in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, on the night of July 14, 1881, and fired twice when a figure moved in the blackness. Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, William Bonney, take your pick, fell and did not get up. Garrett had been Lincoln County's newly elected sheriff, a former drinking companion of the man he was hunting, and a figure who understood that his entire professional future depended on ending a manhunt that had embarrassed New Mexico's territorial administration for 2 years. He collected the reward. He wrote a book about the killing, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, that was so thoroughly ghost-written and so liberally embellished that historians have been untangling it ever since. He was subsequently appointed collector of customs at El Paso by Theodore Roosevelt, made a poor job of it, and was shot dead himself in 1908 during an argument over a land lease. Garrett matters because his single most famous act was performed in darkness, against a man he knew personally, for money and professional survival. The West was like that more often than the mythology admits. The film that comes closest to capturing the ambiguity of Garrett's position is Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973, with James Coburn's gaunt, weather-beaten Garrett and Chris Christopherson's Billy circling each other through a New Mexico that both men understand is already gone. Peckinpah had his own problems with the studio. MGM cut the film extensively against his wishes. But what survives is the most honest screen portrait of a man who chose institutional survival over personal loyalty and spent the rest of his life knowing it. Bob Dylan's score,
written for the film, produced Knockin' on Heaven's Door. Even the music understands what the story cost. Number 8. Tom Horn, 1860 to 1903. Tom Horn is the Wild West legend that the mythology finds hardest to accommodate, because his story does not resolve into heroism, anti-heroism, or even the ambiguous moral complexity that the better Western narratives manage. Horn was a tracker, a packer for General Crook during the Apache campaigns, a Pinkerton operative, and eventually a hired killer for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, a man employed to murder sheep farmers and small ranchers who were challenging the dominance of the large cattle operations in the Johnson County range wars. He was reportedly paid $600 per kill. He left a rock under the head of each victim as a signature. He was eventually tried and hanged in Cheyenne in 1903 for the murder of 14-year-old Willie Nickel, a killing that the evidence suggests Horn may or may not have committed, but whose trial served the needs of a territorial administration that needed Horn's era of hired violence to be officially over. What Horn represents is the West's willingness to use lethal force as an economic instrument, not justice, not law, but corporate interest enforced by a rifle. That story is harder to mythologize. Hollywood has tried several times and never quite managed it. The most serious attempt is Tom Horn, 1980, Steve McQueen's second-to-last film, made when McQueen knew he was dying of cancer and chose this particular story for reasons that now seem entirely biographical. His Horn is quiet, competent, and possessed of a specific kind of dignity that the system he served has decided is no longer useful. McQueen brings to the role an exhaustion so genuine it is almost unbearable to watch. A man who understands that the world has moved past him and cannot find it in himself to pretend otherwise. The film underperformed commercially and has since been recognized as one of the finest late westerns ever made.
Number 7. Doc Holliday, 1851 to 1887. John Henry Holliday was a dentist from Georgia who graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in 1872, contracted tuberculosis the following year, and moved west on medical advice. Dry air was the prescribed treatment, and the Southwest was as dry as the continent got. He spent the remainder of his short life gambling, drinking whiskey that his doctors had specifically prohibited, and being involved in gunfights at a rate that his remaining lung tissue should not have permitted. He was 36 when he died in a Glenwood Springs, Colorado sanatorium in November 1887, and the astonishment, given what he had asked of his body over the preceding 15 years, is that he lasted that long. His friendship with Wyatt Earp is one of the genuine human relationships in the mythology of the West, a bond between a tubercular Southern gambler with what his biographers politely describe as a death wish and a taciturn frontier lawman that the historical record confirms was real, mutual, and sustained across years of shared danger in Dodge City, Tombstone, and the territories between. At the OK Corral, he was armed with a shotgun and a nickel-plated pistol, and was, by the testimony of witnesses, the most aggressive participant in a 30-second engagement that killed 3 men and wounded 2 others. The forensic evidence suggests he killed at least one of the cowboys directly. He killed others before and after. What makes Doc Holliday irreplaceable in the mythology is the specific quality of a man who has been told he is dying and finds in that fact not despair, but a kind of operational freedom that healthy men cannot access. He was already dying. The gunfights were a formality. Every man he faced had more to lose than he did, and he understood this with the clarity of someone who had received his death sentence from a physician rather than a judge. That specific psychological condition, the gambler who has already lost the biggest stake and therefore plays without fear, is what every actor who has portrayed him has been trying to find, with varying degrees of success. Victor Mature played him in John Ford's My Darling Clementine, 1946, as a romantic, doomed figure more interested in Shakespeare than survival, beautifully performed and historically approximate at best. Kirk Douglas brought sharp, explosive volatility to the role in Gunfight at the OK Corral, 1957, which is the right instinct played at the wrong register. Dennis Quaid's gaunt, sweating Doc in Wyatt Earp, 1994, is physically convincing and dramatically underwritten. Val Kilmer's performance in Tombstone, 1993, sardonic, precise, delivering "I'm your Huckleberry" with the languid authority of a man who has genuinely stopped caring about consequences, is the one that landed. Kilmer was not nominated for an Academy Award for it. The Academy has been wrong before. Number 6. Jesse James, 1847 to 1882. Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla before he was an outlaw, a rider with Quantrill's Raiders and Bloody Bill Anderson's Missouri Irregulars, men who burned, tortured, and murdered Union soldiers and civilian sympathizers with a systematic brutality that the Civil War's Eastern theater rarely matched. The Centralia Massacre of September 1864, in which Anderson's men, Jesse James among them, killed and mutilated 22 unarmed Union soldiers pulled from a train, is not the incident the mythology leads with. It should be. Understanding who Jesse James was before the robberies began is the only way to understand why the robberies took the form they did. Not reluctant criminality, but the continuation of a war against federal authority by men who had been taught that federal authority was the enemy and had never quite accepted that the war was over. His bank and train robberies were framed by the sympathetic press, particularly John Newman Edwards of the Kansas City Times, who was the myth's primary architect, as a one-man resistance movement against Northern capital and the railroad interests that were consuming the Missouri of his childhood. Whether James believed this or whether Edwards invented it, the mythology stuck because it answered something real, a genuine grievance in a genuine community about genuine economic power being transferred from local hands to distant ones. The James Younger gang made excellent copy and Edwards provided it. The real Jesse James, by the end of his career, was a nervous, suspicious man who trusted almost no one, moved constantly between aliases and addresses, and had exhausted most of his original gang through attrition, capture, and the disastrous Northfield, Minnesota bank raid of 1876 that shattered the Younger brothers and ended the gang's original configuration. He was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford on April 3, 1882, in his own living room while dusting a picture. The coward Robert Ford, as the ballad named him, was a man James had taken into his home. The West's most celebrated outlaw was betrayed by someone he trusted in the one place he should have been safe. That ending is not glamorous. It is the only honest note in a story that was otherwise substantially constructed by a sympathetic journalist who needed a hero and found one in a man who killed people for money. Hollywood found him irresistible from the earliest days of sound cinema. Tyrone Power played him in Jesse James, 1939, as a wronged farmer driven to outlawry by railroad greed, a romanticized portrait that set the template for every sympathetic outlaw film that followed. Walter Hill's The Long Riders, 1980, casting real brothers as fictional brothers, the Keaches, the Carradines, the Quaids, the Guests, brought genuine ensemble texture to the mythology. But the definitive screen treatment arrived with Andrew Dominik's The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, 2007, with Brad Pitt playing James as a paranoid, charismatic, exhausted man who understands he is becoming a myth while still alive and finds the process terrifying. The film is nearly 3 hours long and earns every minute. Casey Affleck's Robert Ford,
the man who needed the legend and then discovered what killing it actually cost, received an Academy Award nomination and lost. The film lost everything it was nominated for. It is, regardless, the best film ever made about the mythology of the American outlaw.
Number 5. Wild Bill Hickok, 1837 to 1876. James Butler Hickok, Wild Bill to everyone, had a face that the 19th century found extraordinary. Long, blonde hair worn past the shoulders, a cavalry mustache, gray eyes of an unusual pale intensity, the physical bearing of a man who understood that the first thing a gunfight established was whether you were afraid. He was a scout for the Union Army, a spy behind Confederate lines, a deputy marshal in Hays City and Abilene, and eventually a performer in Buffalo Bill Cody's theatrical company touring the eastern states. A career he found professionally unsatisfying and personally humiliating, because the legend of Wild Bill Hickok was worth far more as a commodity than James Butler Hickok's reservations about being one. His actual kill count is disputed across a wide range, depending on which source you believe and how you count the men who died from wounds after the fact. What is not disputed is the specific quality of his presence under pressure, documented by people who watched him work and agreed on one essential point: he did not appear to hurry. His draws were not fast in the theatrical sense the mythology prefers. They were deliberate, the economy of a man who had thought through each step in advance and was executing a plan rather than responding to an emergency. He also suffered from glaucoma in his later years and was going blind, a biographical detail the mythology prefers to omit because it complicates the narrative of the deadliest eyes in the West. He was shot from behind in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, on August 2, 1876, by a drifter named Jack McCall while playing poker at the No. 10 Saloon. The hand he was holding, aces and eights, black suits, has been known as the dead man's hand ever since. His death was the West's most perfectly constructed irony. A man whose survival had depended on never having his back to a room, killed from behind because he couldn't get the seat he wanted at a card table. McCall was tried twice, acquitted by a minors' court in Deadwood, retried by a federal court after the acquittal was voided, and hanged in March 1877. Hickok was 39. Gary Cooper played him in Cecil B. DeMille's The Plainsman, 1936. Handsome, stoic, and about as historically accurate as the frontier costumes Hollywood had not yet learned to research. Jeff Bridges brought a melancholic fatalism to Walter Hill's Wild Bill, 1995, that served the character better than the film's fractured structure served the story. But the screen version of Hickok that most audiences carry in their heads is Keith Carradine's extraordinary portrait across 3 seasons of HBO's Deadwood, 2004 to 2006. A man whose legend has preceded him into a town that needs him to be something he no longer is, performing the role of Wild Bill Hickok for an audience that cannot see what the performance is costing him. Television gave him what cinema never quite managed: enough time to be complicated. Number 4. Wyatt Earp, 1848 to 1929.
Wyatt Earp outlived the Wild West, survived to see himself turned into a legend while he was still alive to dispute it, and died in Los Angeles in 1929 at 80 years old, having spent the last several decades of his life attempting, with mixed success, to manage what the mythology had made of him. The OK Corral, October 26, 1881, approximately 30 seconds, 3 men dead, 2 Earps and Doc Holliday wounded, is the most analyzed gunfight in American history, and one of the most contested, because whether it was a legitimate law enforcement action or a politically motivated assassination of unarmed men depends entirely on which tombstone faction you believe. What is not contested is the vendetta ride that followed. After Morgan Earp was shot dead and Virgil Earp was ambushed and crippled, Wyatt assembled a posse and rode across Arizona Territory in early 1882, killing the men he held responsible. He operated under a federal marshal's warrant of questionable legitimacy in a territory where the county sheriff, his political enemy Johnny Behan, was actively trying to arrest him. He killed at least 3 men on the vendetta ride. He was never tried for any of them. He left Arizona and did not return. What makes Earp the most morally complex figure on this list is the specific quality of his motivation. He was not killing for money or ideology or professional obligation. He was killing for his brothers. The West had no legal framework for that. History has been arguing about whether it should have ever since. The argument has been conducted primarily at the cinema. Henry Fonda played him in John Ford's My Darling Clementine, 1946, as a figure of quiet moral authority, the incoming civilization making its case against the frontier's disorder, a reading that Earp himself, who visited Ford's earlier sets, would probably have approved. Burt Lancaster's Earp in Gunfight at the OK Corral, 1957, is tougher and more self-certain, a star performing confidence rather than investigating character. The two films that arrived simultaneously in 1993 and 1994, Lawrence Kasdan's Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner and George Cosmatos's Tombstone with Kurt Russell, are fascinating precisely because they made such different choices with the same man. Costner played a biography across 3 hours. Russell played a presence across 2. Russell's Earp, roaring, "You tell him I'm coming, and hell's coming with me," after Morgan's murder, is not historical. It is mythological. John Ford would have understood the distinction and printed it anyway.
Number 3. Bass Reeves, 1838 to 1910. Bass Reeves was born enslaved in Arkansas, escaped into Indian Territory during the Civil War, lived among the Creek and Seminole nations long enough to become fluent in several Native American languages, and was appointed a Deputy United States Marshal west of the Mississippi in 1875, one of the first black men to hold that office in American history. He served for 32 years. He arrested over 3,000 felons. He killed 14 men in the line of duty and was never once hit by return fire, which is either extraordinary marksmanship, extraordinary luck, or, more likely, the result of a tactical intelligence that the mythology of the West has rarely credited him with, because the mythology of the West was not designed to accommodate Bass Reeves. He operated primarily in Indian Territory, which would become Oklahoma, in a jurisdiction so violent and so lawless that Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge of Fort Smith, required an army of deputy marshals to manage it. Reeves was among the most effective of them. He used disguises. He thought strategically about approach and exit. He was ambidextrous with a pistol and could shoot accurately with either hand, a skill he had developed to compensate for the fact that the men he was arresting knew who he was and were prepared for him. He arrested his own son for the murder of his son's wife and brought him in without incident. There is a substantial scholarly case that Bass Reeves was the original inspiration for the Lone Ranger, the Silver Bullets, the disguises, the Cherokee Companion, the jurisdiction across Indian Territory all align with documented Reeves' practice. The case is circumstantial but serious. What is not circumstantial is the career record. 3,000 arrests, 14 justified kills, 32 years of service, in one of the most dangerous jurisdictions in American law enforcement history. If Reeves is not the most famous name on this list, that is a problem with the list's historical consciousness, not with Bass Reeves. Hollywood took an embarrassingly long time to address it. It was not until the Paramount Plus series Lawmen, Bass Reeves, 2023, with David Oyelowo producing and starring, that the full scope of Reeves's career received the screen treatment it had warranted for a century. Oyelowo's performance, methodical, morally rigorous,
never romanticizing the violence while never minimizing what it took to deliver justice in Indian Territory, is the screen portrait Reeves deserved. That it took until 2023 to produce it is a statement about whose stories Hollywood decided were worth telling, and when it decided to reconsider.
Number 2. John Wesley Hardin, 1853 to 1895. John Wesley Hardin was named after the founder of Methodism by a circuit preacher father who appears to have produced, in his son, the methodical opposite of everything John Wesley had stood for. He killed his first man at 15, a former slave in a wrestling match gone wrong, in Reconstruction, Texas, where a white teenager killing a black man was not a prosecutable event if you moved fast enough. He did not stop. By the time he was 20, the number of men he had killed was variously reported at between 15 and 25, and the Texas State Police had made him a priority so pressing that they sent multiple rangers after him at once. He escaped, killed more men, was eventually arrested in Florida by a Texas Ranger named John Armstrong, who walked into a train car and pistol-whipped him unconscious before he could draw, and served 16 years in Huntsville State Prison, where he studied law. He was released, passed the Texas bar exam, moved to El Paso, and was shot in the back of the head by a city constable named John Selman on August 19, 1895, while rolling dice at the Acme Saloon. He was 41. Hardin's kill count, which he personally claimed was 42, which contemporary records suggest was closer to 27, which remains the highest documented total of any individual gunfighter in American Western history, is not the most interesting thing about him. The most interesting thing is what he represents. A man for whom violence had become so normalized, so instrumental, so entirely integrated into his daily practice of survival and status, that he continued exercising it long past any rational calculation of self-interest. He had been in prison for 16 years. He had a law degree. He was starting over. He was shot in the back of the head at 41 because he had made so many enemies in so many places that starting over was not something the West was prepared to permit him. The violence he had generated came back. It always comes back. Cinema has largely failed him. Universal's The Lawless Breed, 1952, cast Rock Hudson in the role. Handsome, personable Rock Hudson, whose screen warmth was the precise opposite of everything Hardin represented, and produced a biographical Western that softened its subject into sympathy while draining him of what made him genuinely frightening. The result was a commercially adequate film about a man who deserves something considerably more unsettling. No serious director has yet made the Hardin film the historical record warrants. The story of a man whose capacity for violence was so total and so early developing that it constituted less a character flaw than a way of being in the world. Number 1. Billy the Kid, 1859 to 1881. Henry McCarty, who also went by William Bonney, by Henry Antrim, by Billy the Kid, was 21 years old when Pat Garrett shot him dead in a dark bedroom in New Mexico, and he had been a significant figure in territorial violence since he was 17. The legend says he killed 21 men, one for every year of his life. The actual number, as best the historical record can establish, is closer to 9, still a remarkable body count for a teenager, but considerably less than the mythology requires. The mythology has never cared. Billy the Kid is not famous because of the accurate kill count. He is famous because of what the kill count meant in the context of the Lincoln County War, a range war between two mercantile factions in New Mexico Territory, one of them connected to corrupt territorial officials, the other employing young riders including Billy, and what it revealed about the specific moral landscape of a frontier where the law was owned by the same people it was supposed to regulate. Billy fought on the side of John Tunstall and Alexander McSween,
who were attempting to break the economic monopoly of the Murphy-Dolan faction and their Santa Fe ring connections. When Tunstall was murdered by a posse in February 1878, Billy was present and witnessed the killing. He spent the following 3 years attempting to avenge it through a combination of official legal action — the regulators were briefly deputized — and unofficial violence. He was, depending on your reading, a loyal employee defending his employer's murderers through the only means available to him, or a young man with a talent for violence who found in the Lincoln County War a justification that suited him. The historical record supports both interpretations. It always does, with figures like Billy. What makes Billy the Kid the most significant figure on this list is not the kill count, or the legend, or the 21 films that have been made about him, or the ongoing legal petitions by New Mexico governors to posthumously pardon him. It is the specific quality of his relationship to the system that killed him. He was not opposed to law. He wanted law. He wanted the law to prosecute the men who had murdered John Tunstall in front of him, and when it refused, because the law was owned by the same men who had ordered the murder, he took the matter into his own hands with a teenage gunfighter's confidence that competence with a weapon was a sufficient substitute for institutional justice. It was not. Pat Garrett shot him in the dark at 21, and the New Mexico Territorial Administration that had protected Tunstall's killers declared the case closed. Billy the Kid is the most enduring figure in the mythology of the American West because his story is not about violence. It is about what happens when the institutions that are supposed to deliver justice are themselves the source of injustice, when the law is the enemy, and the only available response is a gun. That is not a story that belongs to 1878. It is a story the country has been telling about itself ever since. No figure in this list has generated more films. Estimates put the number at over 50 theatrical features and television productions since the silent era. Johnny Mack Brown played him in King Vidor's Billy the Kid, 1930, the first sound version, as a straightforward Robin Hood figure. Paul Newman gave him a method actor's tortured interiority in Arthur Penn's The Left-Handed Gun, 1958, a film ahead of its cultural moment that critics dismissed and revisionists have since elevated. Chris Christopherson played him in Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973, with a sun-bleached, already mythological quality, a young man who understands he has become a story. Emilio Estevez's Billy in Young Guns, 1988, and Young Guns 2, 1990, delivered a generation's introduction to the Lincoln County War through the grammar of the 1980s teen ensemble film, which is a strange vehicle for the story but not an ineffective one. The films keep coming because the story keeps resonating. The young man who wanted justice couldn't get it through the system and paid the price for going around it. 10 lives, 10 deaths, most of them violent, none of them simple. The mythology the American West produced about these people required certain things from them: clear moral alignment, memorable deaths, kill counts that could be printed in round numbers in newspaper headlines. The reality was messier, more ambiguous, and considerably more revealing. Belle Starr was murdered and no one was convicted. Pat Garrett was shot over a land lease. Tom Horn was hanged for a murder the evidence couldn't conclusively establish. Jesse James was betrayed by a man he trusted. Wild Bill was shot from behind in a card game. Wyatt Earp lived to 80 and watched Hollywood argue about him.